Good morning. Today we're going to finish up our last work for our class, and that is Josef Pieper's Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. Now, as you can tell, I'm sitting and I don't have my whiteboard behind me. The whiteboard had a little mishap this morning, so I'm not going to be able to use it. That's fine. We're just going to go through the book, and I'm just going to pick out some kind of go through and talk about what Pieper is trying to say in this book. We're going to focus mainly on the first section of this book, which goes through page 39. Pages 41 and 54 are important to read, but that's not really going to be the focus of this particular lecture. So really, I guess I'm saying the only thing that you're responsible for is up into page 39. Other than that, you don't need to kind of worry about it. So this is a very, I think, important book. It was written originally back in the 70s by Pieper, so this was 1974, and this is good probably almost 30 years after he wrote the Philosophical Act. But Pieper in this book is sort of addressing a phenomenon of how societies and cultures use language. Philosophically, it's probably important for us to think about what exactly language is. What does language do, right? And most people, you might say, might come up with the idea, well, language communicates, which is true. But then the question would be, well, what is the language trying to communicate? And Pieper is going to kind of give us an idea of what this looks like and how we should think about the uses of language. And when we're reading this, I would like you to try to remember what Nietzsche said, particularly in Reason and Philosophy, where Nietzsche sort of recognizes that language of its nature already frames the world in a certain way. And for Nietzsche, he wanted to sort of have this idea that the world is continual flux, which is a Latin word for change. So things are always changing, and there's no steady base of reality, okay, or anything like being. Everything is always unfolding, always evolving, always changing. Things do grow, but things degenerate and decline. And in the space of this, Nietzsche says that a human being has to learn how to make their way in the world, which is a world at bottom that has no meaning. Well, the problem with language is that language already assumes a certain meaning to things. In other words, if I say tree, I'm suggesting a particular physical referent by that word. All right. Or if I say car or young boy or old man or red or things like this, I'm suggesting particular things in the world. And then when we start talking about things that are not as tangible, love, friendship, peace, anger, envy, these sorts of things, they do suggest something. They are not necessarily as tangible, but we have an idea of what it means. I mean, I can't say water and think of something literally solid. Okay. Now we could talk about ice, and then there's poetic uses of language where you kind of take words and maybe juxtaposition them in a certain way to bring out a certain meaning. But if you're talking about water, strictly speaking, you're not talking about a solid, right? Well, Nietzsche recognizes that language captures the world in a certain way, or he's going to say it captures the world in a certain way, and it's sort of metaphysically, um, he would say, sort of metaphysically coercive, or maybe a better way to say it, it's coercive toward metaphysics. In fact, Nietzsche will call language the metaphysics of the masses. In other words, a great number of people won't do philosophy, but insofar as they use language, they're sort of metaphysicians. In other words, they're dealing with being. So for Nietzsche, he saw the problem of language, particularly if you were someone who believed that the world had no meaning because the world really has no reason to be here. There's no God that creates it or some sort of transcendental reality that sort of upholds or pervades the world in a certain way. It just kind of exists and it's always changing, and that's what it is. Um, and so for him, that's why he has that great line in Reason and Philosophy where he says, "Reason, old, what a tricky old woman she is. I'm afraid we are not rid of God because we believe in grammar." Right? So this idea that somehow we can't jettison from ourselves this idea of being and there's some sort of permanence without there being language. Well, Nietzsche, Pieper is going to be kind of coming at this from a completely different end. And he is going to be making the argument that language is our sort of conduit to reality. And in a certain sense, it's also a way of establishing a real relationship with others. Okay. And that far from what Nietzsche is saying, that the reason why language is metaphysically oriented is because we intuit and we see and we sort of understand that there is something permanent underneath all the change that we see, right? And so you might have a particular tree, and let's just say it's a species of tree that no longer exists. Well, strictly speaking, yes, the tree is gone, but that doesn't change the fact that there are things like trees, and that even if this tree is no longer in existence, let's just say it's not, biologically part of the world anymore, and the only thing we have maybe is fossilized remains of it. Maybe sometimes you've heard of petrified wood or something like that. That doesn't mean that if we were studying it, that this tree would have a particular form of being that would let's just say it was a conifer, so it was some sort of pine tree. So if it was a conifer, that means that it wouldn't be like a hardwood, like an oak. It's just got a different sort of within the sort of taxonomy of trees. It's going to have a different sort of uh, physical instantiation. Okay, so when Pieper is writing this book, he's actually very concerned about a phenomenon that he thinks is kind of afoot in the modern world. And this is this idea of abusing language. And for Pieper, he's going to understand that to abuse language in a certain sense is to abuse power. And we hear that word a lot, this idea of power. And who has power and who doesn't have power. It's a perennial, challenge and problem in society that people who have power and authority sometimes misuse that, and that other groups suffer because of that. But Nietzsche or Plato or Pieper, Plato will talk about this. Pieper is going to say this is a perennial danger. Remember, we have those perennial questions: who am I? Why am I here? How should I live? Questions that have always been a part of society that every generation has to sort of confront. and try to understand. Well, this is sort of a perennial challenge, this idea of abusing power. And usually abusing power, he is going to say, begins with abuse of the word or abuse of language. So we're just going to go ahead and kind of dig into this a little bit. And he starts talking about at the very beginning of the book, and this would be, I guess, on page 7, that he introduces what the topic of this essay is. And he's going to, one of the questions is, that he's going to open up with that, and he's looking at this from the particular standpoint of Plato, okay? And I'll just kind of read the first little couple paragraphs here, but he says the topic of this essay can also be stated as the abuse of language in its relationship to the abuse of power. And I intend to approach this subject from 2 different directions, though these are 2 distinct considerations, and I shall try to show their intrinsic connection. So he's going to try to show, he's going to talk about abuse of language and then how this is abuse of power. And he's talking about, this goes back very, this has a long history, sort of abuse of language and abuse of power. And he kind of talks about Socrates' lifelong battle with the sophists. And the question is, well, who is the sophist? And he kind of tells you they were these highly paid and popular applauded experts in the art of twisting words, who were able to sweet talk something black into something good, or something bad into something good, and turn something white into black, and where you could say turn something up to down or whatever, right? And so they were just eloquent speakers. And historically speaking, the sophists were a group of teachers who existed in sort of the Greek world. Initially, they had sort of expertise in teaching subjects like geometry or arithmetic. Maybe they taught rhetoric, which was the art of speaking, or even music. But over time, they began to say that they could teach what human excellence is, which would be this idea, the Greek concept of arete, which is virtue. And over time, their idea of excellence, because they were very intelligent, very sophisticated, this sometimes came to mean that they could teach the art of speaking well. And in the Roman, or in the Greco world then, the Greek world, the idea of being able to speak well was very important, because most, at this time, young men would be able to take part in politics. And if you were persuasive and you could do well in that, you could become very successful and possibly very powerful, and on the road to that, also very wealthy. Okay, and so a lot of Greeks, particularly if we're looking at Athens, where Plato was from, a lot of wealthy Athenians would pay for their sons to be taught by these sophists. And if you were reading remember the Apology, that was one of the things that Socrates was being charged with, was this idea of making or corrupting the youth. And so there's this sort of irony here. A lot of the Athenians are sending their sons to be educated by these sophists, but at the same time, they recognize that the sophists are people who are corrupting the youth. In other words, they're kind of taking the world that the youth is being taught about, that there is a right and a wrong, and a good and a bad, and all this stuff, and sort of inverting that. Okay? And I just want to say, this is sort of a complex phenomenon. Anybody that tries to talk about history or cultures and tries to reduce it down to like whatever good existed in the society or whatever bad existed in the society is all traceable to this one thing and this one thing alone. Well, you might want to be a little suspicious of that because life is usually a little more complex than that. Certainly, you can have events or persons that contribute probably a very significant effect in a society or in a time period of history. And it can be so pervasive or so strong or dominant, it could appear to be, and it might be the major sort of effect. But there are also little other subtle things that sort of figure into this too. And so the point I'm just trying to make here is that the sophists, by sometimes calling into question some things in society, they may not necessarily have been wrong in questioning that. Okay. The problem might come in the idea in that in questioning it, they may have just ended up just questioning all senses of value or all senses of authority or all senses of learning or any sense of meaning. Okay. It could be instead of looking at an authority that might be abused or misused or an illegitimate authority, to question that might be very helpful. But then if you go to the opposite extreme and you say all authority is bad, well, that would probably be problematic. And then likewise, if you went to the other extreme and said any questioning of authority is bad, well, that's problematic too. And the problem is that trying to figure out how and when and in what way to do some of these things can be kind of difficult. So he kind of defines who the sophists are. They're these sort of highly paid teachers who were very gifted in the art of speaking and in persuasion and to some extent to writing. Okay. And he says that this is a problem that's kind of with us now. And Pieper is going to be sort of at pains to say that, look, the problem at this point, we'll just call it the problem of sophistry. Okay. And we'll just say at this point, the problem of sophistry is the use of words and language or communication to acquire power over people, okay, for kind of self-gain, we'll just say. The problem of sophistry is a perennial problem. There is never a time when this problem would not be possible. As long as you have human beings who are using language, and particularly if you have a society that is highly advanced in terms of sophistication and technology and art and things like this, it's probably even more of a danger. And I'll pick up on page 8 where he says, and about a fourth way down the page, he says, and anything that may first sound like a mere critique of the present aimed at our own situation should also be taken as pointing to a timeless temptation, which he's talking about sophistry, that since the beginning of history has always required mankind's resistance and will require it forever. The timeless character of the sophistic phenomenon, transcending any particular age, prompted certain important, indeed disturbing comments by Hegel. And Hegel was a philosopher in the kind of the early mid 19th century, very influential German philosopher. He's very influential on the philosopher Karl Marx. And he said, true, he called the sophists of Socrates' time extremely refined and learned people. But such praise in Hegel's manner of speaking sounds somewhat ambiguous. Um, it is precisely such learned refinement, says Hegel, such absolute and unmoored questioning that plucks apart any object and dialectically discredits everything. It is such refined reasoning, an expression repeatedly used by Hegel, that poses the true danger. It inevitably leads, as Hegel, to the conviction that everything can be justified if we look hard enough for reasons. That's an important point. So part of the assumption of sophistry is that anything can be justified, everything can be justified if you look hard enough for reasons. And so to quote Hegel, you need not have advanced very far in your learning in order to find good reasons, even for the most evil things. All the evil deeds in the world since Adam and Eve were justified by good reasons. Okay, and he's kind of using Adam and Eve there as sort of a metaphor. But the problem is, and Pieper is going to point to this, when we look at the human mind is a great gift, obviously, and a lot of good comes from the human mind. We can just think about all the things that we have. I mean, sort of the advances in law and the idea of civil liberties and civil rights. You have the advances of technology, the fact that I can kind of use this computer to do this lecture in a time when we're kind of have challenges of being able to be together. All of these things are a great good. Yet at the same time, the human mind can also be very, particularly if it's unmoored from any kind of sense of truth or goodness, can be very destructive at the same time too. And so again, the thing that's important for us to understand is there's this kind of dynamic tension that exists in human societies. In every human being and in every human society, there's some good and there's some bad. And these things are kind of in a tug of war with one another a little bit. So he's going to go on and kind of talk about Plato's sort of contention. What's his main beef with the sophists? And he's going to kind of say around page 10 that I'm reading at the bottom of page 10, the last paragraph on that page. He says, we begin to notice, or to begin with, we notice the fact that these men are exceptionally successful, which shows every now and then prompts the sardonic admiration on the part of Socrates. He notices, and this is an important idea, the merchandising of wisdom, this disregard for the essential difference between money and the spirit, as if there were no difference between what is called the liberal arts and what we call menial work, as if there was no difference between an honorarium and a wage. Okay, so what is he kind of saying here? Well, the first contention that he has against the sophists is this idea of the merchandising of wisdom or knowledge. And he's basically saying that, look, there is an incommensurability. In other words, the two things they are completely different. And what two things are completely different? Well, the life of the mind, the life and the development of the mind and wisdom is completely different than the acquisition of money and material success. In other words, they're just completely different aims. We talked about, kind of what an aim is. Okay. The aim of philosophy is much different than the aim of finance. Finance is not bad. Okay. But the two things are completely different. But what the sophists had done is they had kind of said that the life of the mind and the pursuit of wisdom can be a way to financial success. Now, the thing is that their idea of what wisdom was and a life of the mind would be diametrically opposed to what Plato would have said was actually what the life of the mind was. So the first contention he has is just this sort of merchandising of wisdom and making the life of the mind and the pursuit of wisdom into sort of a money-making opportunity. Okay. And a money-making opportunity in the sense, it's not necessarily like I'm going to teach and make money that way. It could also, I'm going to teach you the art of speaking well, and then wherever you go in life, you're just going to be an utter success. And by being an utter success, you're going to get the things that most people would probably want: power, wealth, and fame, right? So that's his sort of first contention with the sophist here, okay? And then the second one that he's going to talk about, and you'll kind of see this, he starts talking about this on page 12, okay? And he just starts off with saying, then there's the other aspect in the manner the sophist presented. And Plato depicts them, without exception, as strangely handsome, these adversaries of Socrates, who himself is ugly like Silenus. All right. And so in other words, the sophists were very appealing. They, Plato would say, Socrates would notice that they were strangely handsome, good looking, pleasant to look at, which is, and not too surprising because the Greek world really admired sort of physical beauty. That's a very important idea in the Greek world. But Plato noticed that it had taken on sort of an exaggerated importance. So what's he getting at here? Well, the second contention here is that this recognition that they're strangely handsome is basically picking up on that what the sophists do is very appealing. And what's appealing about them is their art of speaking and writing persuasively. Okay. And so, and this is going to be kind of a subtle point, Plato is not necessarily against writing and speaking well. Okay. He's not against the art of rhetoric per se. And the art of rhetoric is to write and to speak well. But remember, every art has an aim. And so what is the aim? Well, for the sophists, the art of speaking and writing well was to acquire power, wealth, and material gain. Okay. It was to acquire power, wealth, and material gain. Okay. Whereas for Plato, rhetoric, the art of speaking and writing well, should be with the aim of helping people understand and to devote themselves to what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. Well, you can kind of see that those are two diametrically different understandings of the use of language and words. Okay. One is to kind of create a fuller sort of world in relation to what is good, what is true, what is beautiful. All right. And the other is this idea that Well, it helps us acquire, and it should be help us to acquire wealth, power, and material gain. Um, and again, Plato's not necessarily against somebody writing persuasively, maybe to become a political leader or something, but it depends on what the end of that political leader is. If it's for a good cause, like, look, I can really think I can help our society here. Um, but there's a subtle danger. The person might actually think they're doing well, and might employ words and language in a way that's not in keeping with what reality is. Okay, so at this point, Socrates or Plato is kind of ruminating on sort of what the problem is with the sophists, uh, and it seems like uh, one of the things that we're kind of dealing with here uh, is that, and I'm reading on page 14, okay, on page 14, the last paragraph, his objection, he's talking about to the sophists, like, what is this real objection to the sophists? His objections could tentatively be summed up in these brief terms: corruption of the word, you are corrupting the language. So if you corrupt words, you corrupt the language. Now he's going to say this is a big problem. Okay. And why is this a big problem? Um, well, because when you begin to do this, you're kind of laying an axe to the root of what binds us together as human beings. So this is a very important phenomenon. It's critically important to sort of understand what's going on here. And so I'm going to keep kind of reading here. He says the specific threat for Plato comes from the sophist way of cultivating the word with exceptional awareness of linguistic nuances and utmost formal intelligence, from their way of pushing and perfecting the employment of verbal constructions to crafty limits, thereby, and precisely in this, corrupting the meaning and the dignity of the very same words. Okay? And he says that if language, a little further, that if language becomes corrupted, okay, human existence itself can't remain sort of unaffected or untainted. All right. And so, uh, and some of you here may have remembered when you were in high school. I don't know if really you read it in college, but in high school, a lot of you may have read 1984 by George Orwell. And a lot of you may be familiar with that, but it's basically a work written by Orwell about sort of dystopian future where humans live under this sort of tyrannical government, kind of known as Big Brother, and one of the ways that people are sort of kept under tyranny is through how words and language are manipulated in the service of those who are holding power. Okay, so this is kind of what Pieper's getting at. Now, here's the thing: language can certainly be corrupted by those who are holding power, but it can also be corrupted by those who may be seeking power. And it can be corrupted by people holding power who actually mean well and are trying to serve some good end. It can also be corrupted by people who are seeking to acquire power, maybe from an illegitimate authority, but are doing it. But in doing so, they're corrupting the very language that is needed to create sort of a healthy society. So then to understand what's going on when you're corrupting language, Pieper is just going to kind of point out kind of the twofold purposes of words and language. And you can start reading this on page 15, and it kind of tells you very briefly. It's the very last paragraph. But words and language do two things. And I think this is very important for you to remember. It's important for me to remember. It's important for everybody to remember. Okay? Words do and language does two things for human beings. It conveys reality. And the second thing he says on page 15 at the bottom of the page, it establishes a relationship with people. So, and I'll just kind of read the little paragraph there, kind of midway down, or the last paragraph, kind of midway in that paragraph. He says, here we can pick up on the twofold purpose of words. First, words convey reality. We speak in order to name and identify something that is real, to identify it for someone, of course. And this points to the second aspect in question, the interpersonal character of human speech. So in other words, when I use language, I am trying to convey something that is real, or at least something that I think is real, to someone else. Okay. And, a few weeks ago, I think I had mentioned to you in an email that I'd hurt my back really badly. And so I went to the doctor, I went to a chiropractor, actually, first time I've ever been. And I was using language and words to convey to him kind of what I thought the problem was. I always thought I had a problem with my oblique muscle, and that's what it was. And I had been doing exercises to kind of help the oblique muscle and stuff and everything. Well, it turned out really it wasn't my oblique muscle, the real problem. And because the doctor then started using language to me, like asking me questions. Well, does it hurt when you do this? No, blah, 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 blah. And so in that medium and in that exchange, it turns out that the problem's not an oblique muscle for me. It was like it's called a hip flexor muscle. And so he kind of did whatever he needed to do, and I am much better today. Now, it's in some sense a very kind of simplistic sort of idea. But when I go to say something to someone, I am trying to convey what's sort of real about what's going on. And I may not necessarily know, but I'm at least trying to convey something that I think is real. And if for some reason it turns out that what I thought was real is not really the case, like with the oblique muscle, then I'm like, oh, and if the guy is can kind of show me and give me reasons and stuff, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Well, let's try that. And he tried it, and it worked. Okay. And, kind of took me through and showed me a chart where everything was. Okay. So, and that's what language is meant to do. And so the other idea here, though, so when you're saying, well, look, when you're trying to, you're saying you're using language to convey reality to people. But is that always the case? Well, it should be the case, because if you're not using language to convey reality to people, what's really real, the opposite of that is lying. Because when you lie, you tell people something that's not really the case. And by lying, I mean like intentionally trying to deceive somebody. Like, if my wife asked me, have you seen my car keys? And I said, yeah, they're on the kitchen table. And they turned out not to be. Well, I was just mistaken. I thought they were there, but I didn't lie. Now, then, maybe they're not on the kitchen table. Maybe she left them on our on the bedside table or something like that. Well, I was there, I was misguided. Okay, I was wrong. But if she asked me that and I intentionally said, "Oh, yeah, they're on the kitchen table," and I just wanted to make her late or something, well, that'd be very bad, right? And Pieper is going to say that unless language, at least at the intent of it, is to convey meaningfully reality as it is, or at least as we understand it, anything less than that is to degenerate from the true purpose of language and can ultimately become sort of a lie. Okay? Now, there's an interpersonal dimension to this because the unfortunate thing, we really didn't read enough Plato for you to get a sense of this. But in these Platonic dialogues where Socrates is talking to other people, they are trying to figure something out. What is the nature of courage, as in one dialogue. And by going back and forth, you can find what I might think is a good answer to something. Somebody say, well, what is courage? And I kind of go, oh, well, I think it's blah. And then somebody says, well, what about X? And they go, I didn't think about that. Well, I need to kind of revise. Yeah, that's a good point. Blah, 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 blah. And then I say, well, I think courage is this. And then they say, well, what about Y? And I go, oh, yeah, Y is a good point. But I don't think that's it because of blah, 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 blah. And if the person goes, oh, yeah, I can kind of see where you're coming from, then you start kind of building up sort of meaning in that way. You start kind of seeing what the state of affairs is. Because, guys, philosophy proceeds through reason, but also human experience. So, the human experience part, I don't think most people really appreciate enough. But what we're trying to say there is that I want you to kind of envision a situation where when children come into the world, let's just say the only thing we did was teach them language, but then we didn't teach them anything about what had come before them. We did everything for them. Really didn't teach them how to build a fire or how to grow food or whatever. Every generation would have to find that out for themselves. Well, there's no way you could have human culture. You have to sort of retain and hand on the experience that has been accrued over hundreds of generations to the next generation. And there can be some things that are handed on that are probably better left in the past. And that's not always easy to see or easy to do. And sometimes it's not done perfectly. But you have to, not only with reason, but you have to give people some sort of scaffolding to begin reasoning from. And that scaffolding comes in the mode of our just experiences and traditions that are handed on. And some traditions are really good, but some traditions can be very bad. And that's where reason can kind of come in and refine. Oh, yeah. Well, this is this is a really good part of the tradition. But this part, maybe at one time it was good or it served a purpose, but it's not useful anymore. Okay. Or maybe someone is saying, oh, look, yeah, there were some bad things in the tradition. We just need to get rid of all the tradition, start all over from the ground up. And maybe somebody says, well, no, there's some things here that are actually kind of good. We need to retain. Well, you have to have a sort of freedom to be able to have these discussions so human culture can continue to grow. Okay. And I want to say something here too, is we need to Plato and Pieper would say we need to be aware of what we mean when we say to hand on for human culture to grow. Um, like we want children to grow, right? But they just don't grow indefinitely. Like you reach a certain point, in life, and you've kind of hit the high mark, maybe physically and emotionally and maybe mentally. And then at some point, life starts, in an individual starts tracking down. In other words, we get older, things start wearing out, right? Well, it can be the same things with human cultures, that, you know, there's only so much that you can do. With the best that you can, Plato would probably say that you can do is you are trying to hand on the best of what we've learned to the next generation and try to advance human flourishing as far as it's possible, given the limited and finite nature of human beings. Okay, because human beings are finite and limited. We're just not utterly open ended in the sense of being able to always progress. Um, that's what Plato would say. Although some people are of a different mind. I mean, you've got kind of your transhumanists who kind of feel that, if we can, it's kind of the idea of the singularity, if we can merge ourselves with machines, human beings can become sort of immortal, and we can then transcend all of our biological limitations. Uh, and on a certain level, that sounds intriguing and good, and some people are really into it and they mean well by it. But Plato and Pieper would be very suspicious of that. And I think, in my opinion, they're probably right to be. That's what all your dystopian novels are usually about, this idea of pursuing the perfect state of affairs for human beings. But in order to have that, you have to have kind of a monstrosity in the terms of a society. So that's what the twofold purpose of words are. And so I'm going to kind of go through and talk about just his idea of, we've talked about to convey reality. And he talks about what does it mean for something to be true. And for something to be true, and you can find this on page 17. Okay, so we don't want to convey corrupt reality. Okay, we want to speak the truth. And what is speaking the truth? Well, in the middle of page 17, it says it means to be true means to be determined in speech and thought by what is real. To be determined in speech and thought by what is real. Now, if you're thinking, well, how do we know what's real? Well, we may not know what ultimate reality is, but we do know there are some things that are real. Rocks are real. Trees are real. Water's real. These have real properties. There are some things about human nature that is just real. I mean, my wife and I were having a discussion the other night about, our kids. My son's a sophomore in high school, and my daughter's going into middle school in sixth grade. And, particularly, my daughter will sometimes get a little upset because her brother's got a later bedtime. Sometimes my son will get a little put out because he's doing a little extra work around the house that maybe she doesn't do. It's because they're just different ages and different maturity levels and stuff. And so, but I was telling my wife, well, we need to kind of talk to them, about all of us being on the same page, and we need to kind of get them past this arguing over, that they're not necessarily being treated the same. So I'm just kind of saying passive. And she said, yeah, we need to work on that. But she said, but they're going to do that because they're brother and sister. So in other words, there is a reality to human relationships. If you wanted to try to create, think if someone came to you and said, I think I have a way of making it where brothers or siblings would never fight or argue. If you would be suspicious of that and think that that was nonsense, you would probably be very correct, because that would just be impossible. There's absolutely no way that you could keep brothers and sisters, or brothers and brothers, or sisters and sisters from arguing with one another, because that's just what they're going to do when they're young, and maybe even when they get older. And to try to keep that from ever happening, you would have to create just an absolute totalitarian sort of system where you almost would make it where they couldn't even talk to one another. So to be true means to be determined in speech and thought by what is real. So that means there is real things out there and that we can know them. Okay. But then what happens? Well, sometimes we can get to a point where, and he's going to talk about this when it's kind of called the dangerous possibility. So we want to be determined by what's real, but there's this dangerous possibility. What is a dangerous possibility? Well, it's at the bottom of page 18. Okay. And he says, well, let me back up. It's on page 18. I'm going to start reading where it says the orientation toward reality. Okay, so if you can find that on page 18. The orientation toward reality, the truth itself, and this is what it amounts to, can in all honesty not be the decisive concern of those who aim at verbal artistry. Okay, so in other words, for people who are more concerned with how they speak than what they say, these people can never be concerned with what the truth is. And even if they were wanting to be concerned with what the truth is, they're never going to find it. So then I'm going to skip down to the next paragraph where he's going to quote, at that time, a contemporary writer. And this writer says, quote, a writer can be defined as someone whose second nature is the conviction that the content of his thoughts and writings does not matter in the least. Okay. And skipping down a little further in that paragraph, it's the idea that what is decisive is not what you say, but how you say it, its composition, its expression, its form. All right. And so then this gets to the dangerous possibility. Still, Plato's concern, and this is at the bottom of 18. Still, Plato's concern points towards something else, and he insists on it, and he challenges us with it, even challenging himself and his own profound sensitivity to linguistic form. The possibility that something could well be superbly crafted, that is, perfectly worded, brilliantly formulated, strikingly written, performed, staged, put on screen, and yet at the same time, in its entire thrust and essence, be false. And not only false, but outright bad, inferior, contemptible, shameful, destructive, wretched, and still marvelously put together. Now, that might sound like, well, wow, that's kind of a little over the top, don't you think? Well, If you ever, for a lot of people who study film, one of the greatest, it's usually considered one of the greatest um, cinematic features that was ever produced, like in terms of its form, in terms of it as being a film that's been choreographed, written, shot, um, sort of the progression of how it builds on itself. Okay. Film students are sometimes shown a film and says that in terms of the content of a film and just what it's trying to do, this is really superb craftsmanship. That film would be called Triumph of the Will. And Triumph of the Will was a film that was made about the Nuremberg rally for Adolf Hitler. So here you have something that's been superbly crafted, and yet at base, I would say is utterly contemptible, bad, evil. And yet, in terms of its form, is utterly superb. Now that should give us sort of pause. This idea that just because something is said or written or sung or staged or shot in a beautiful, professional, almost sort of impeccable manner, it could actually be completely bad in terms of what it's essentially trying to say. Whereas the opposite, something could be kind of shoddy, not said well, but actually get to the truth of what actually something is. And so, and this is an important part. This is on page 19. I'm picking up where I left off. Plato does not say, quote, if something is marvelously put together, then you should have your suspicions right away. No, he simply asks to be aware of the possibility of something being superbly crafted and nonetheless a sham and foul. Unless, to quote Plato's Socrates, we define linguistic artist as the speaker of truth. Okay. So how do we get here? Well, we get here through a phenomenon, and I'm going to try to wrap this up in 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to go kind of quick here. We get here through what he calls the art of flattery. And he's going to kind of talk to you about what flattery is. And what the sophist does is that they seek to flatter the person. And the flatterer is not just someone who tells somebody something that they want to hear. You're told something that you want to hear because the speaker wants to get something from you. So it's a form of manipulation. So if I told you, I really like your shoes. I might really like your shoes. The fact that I'm telling you I like your shoes is not necessarily a bad thing. But if I tell you I like your shoes in order to try to ingratiate myself to you in such a way to get something from you, well, this now becomes a form of flattery. And the problem with that is I'm using language as a means of manipulating you and giving you a false impression that I really like your shoes. I'm trying to convey reality. I may not like your shoes at all. I might be just saying that because I want to get something from you. Okay. And again, remember, there's this manipulation of of language and reality of how the affairs really stand. You might think I'm saying that because I like your fashion sense. And really what it is, I just want to get something from you. So, so the flatterer is trying to use language in a way to get something from you. And it is used as an instrument of, he would say, power. And he kind of goes that, if you think about this, he would say that there could be whole swaths of modern civilization that is just basically at root forms of flattery. And one example that he kind of hints around at is sort of the advertising industry, right? A lot of the advertisements we see sort of sometimes, they're just there to sell us something. But they kind of can flatter us in the sense of they kind of make appeals to, well, you deserve this. You should have what you desire. You've worked hard. And if you're reading on the bottom of, I guess, 23, because he talks about like all this advertising and stuff, there's a great deal of psychological sort of research that's done on human beings and just how we are in order to manipulate us to sell us things. It's the same thing with using the internet and on video games. And you can see this. I mean, I forgot the guy's name in Silicon Valley, but that the software designers, particularly with video games and in Facebook and other places like this, have studied the human brain to know how to manipulate people to keep clicking, to keep in. In other words, they have studied addiction, how people become addicted. And so they exploit that. Well, that is an abuse of language. And that is certainly an abuse of power. Because even if they mean well to do that, you're basically reducing people to just unreflective, just sort of didactic responses to what they're seeing on the screen, to keep them hooked, to keep them present on the web so the person can make money. So he says at the bottom of 23, all the more questionable may be the fact that an inside knowledge, the psychoanalytical knowledge of man, is manipulatively employed in this business, talking about advertising, but we can also talk about in social media and in the Silicon Valley. We should also consider how ubiquitous commercials in turn possess the power to influence attitudes, as these commercials propagate a dream world primarily by glorifying human weakness. A dream world, in other words, just a waking dream. It's this idea of, like this, I was even thinking about this with Amazon Prime, where, I can order something and get it delivered the next day. It's like there's no delayed gratification. If I want something, I can have it immediately. But really, that's not life. And then when I start thinking about it from an ethical standpoint, the people that work at Amazon, I mean, they're not like the delivery people and the people that work in the warehouse. They're just trying to make a living. But there are very strict and stringent metrics on these people to process so many packages per hour. And you have folks that, kind of injuring and hurting themselves to keep up with production. And some people can and some people can't. All in order for a person to not have to wait any longer than they should for a package, which is sort of, sort of starts bordering on kind of an unjust condition to a certain extent. So the flattery, again, is this idea of telling you something that you want to hear in order to get what you want. And then Plato or Pieper is going to talk about what is the real beef with Socrates, or what is Plato's real beef with the sophists. And the real beef he has is that they create a fictitious reality. And I'm going to read this. I think it's bear reading on page 34. Okay, they create a fictitious reality. Page 34, he says, Plato's literary activity extended over 50 years. And time again, he asked himself anew, what is it that makes the sophist so dangerous? Toward the end, he wrote one more dialogue, The Sophist, in which he added a new element to his answer. The sophists, he says, fabricate a fictitious reality. That the existential realm of man could be taken over by pseudo-realities whose fictitious nature threatens to become indiscernible is truly a depressing thought. And yet, this Platonic nightmare, I hold, possesses an alarming contemporary relevance. For the general public is being reduced to a state where not only are they unable to find out about the truth, but also become unable even to search for the truth because they are justified with deception and trickery and have become and have determined their convictions satisfied with fictitious realities created and designed through abuse of language. This, says Plato, is the worst thing that the sophists are capable of wreaking upon mankind in the corruption of the word. And really what it is creating a fictitious world. What you actually think is real is not real. And if this sounds odd, there was a French philosopher, Jean Baudrillard, who he died, I think, maybe within the past 10 years. But he would talk about sort of television and marketing and all this sort of apparatus we have. And he said that it created sort of a hyper reality. And in other words, the hyper reality of like television, newspapers, film, and even the internet, all these sort of mediums of information, they become hyper real in the sense that they're more real to me and affect me more than my actual day-to-day life. And I'll give you a perfect example, at least from my own life. There was a sense where years ago, I remember when the first Bush and Al Gore ran for president, and and it was a really contentious time, and the election was held up for a long time. I remember I started getting kind of like angry. Everybody's got their kind of political side. I'm like, this is ridiculous, and how can that side think that? Blah blah blah, blah blah blah, and all this stuff. And then at some point, I was like, I'm getting myself kind of worked out. I'm just going to kind of cut the news off. This is going to kind of be done. Somebody's going to be president. Hopefully it's my guy. If it's not my guy, whatever. Life's going to go on. I've got school I have to worry with, and all this sort of thing. And I noticed something. When I turned off the news, and you can have things that are happening, but like my day-to-day relationships with people, everything was okay. Like life was all right. But when my life was sort of being filtered through through what I was reading in the newspaper, what I was seeing on the news, what I read on this blog or whatever, or the internet. It sort of caused me to lose track of the actual life that I was living. Now, I'm not saying that you should never watch the news or not be aware of current events or something. The point is that even when we see the news, and it doesn't matter whether it's CNN or Fox or MSNBC or Click to Houston or Channel 11 or the New York Times or the Washington Post, all of these mediums are going to be kind of coming at things from a certain angle. And to some extent, that's fine and to be expected. But a thinking person has to understand that there's something beyond just the limited angle. You got to start kind of looking at the big picture. And it is possible to get the big picture. If you're asking, well, where's the big picture? Well, part of it is in philosophy. Pieper, Plato, and I would even say to the extent that Nietzsche is sort of against being called a philosopher, Nietzsche would say it's possible to have kind of a big picture in the sense that he would even say that it's possible to kind of winnow out what's sort of nonsense from what's real, although that kind of cuts against his idea of language, but that's for a different story. So toward the end here, on page 35 and 36, he's just going to talk about 3 statements that Socrates is going to make about language. And I'm just going to kind of give you these, but I'm going to give you these in my own words. Okay, so I'm going to kind of change it up a little bit, but you can read over it. The first statement is that we must know reality as it is, as far as possible, and not settle for how we would like the world to appear to us. So we need to know the world as it is, as far as it is possible, and not how we would like the world to appear to us or to be. So in other words, I have to live in the world as it actually is, not in the world as I would like it to be. So, I would like a world where I was never inconvenienced. Well, that's just not reality. I'm going to be inconvenienced at times. I would like a world where everybody thought like me. Well, that's just not possible. That's not reality. Nobody's ever going to do it. And to do that, you would have to create an unjust society, right? So I have to live in the world that I'm in, not in the world that I wish it to be. Now, that doesn't mean that if there's an unjust situation or something, that we can't work to change those things. But we have to work in the sense of appreciating the limited and finite nature of human beings. I mean, I'm working on helping my son and daughter get along and understand each other better. But if I were doing that with the goal of these people are never going to fight or argue, that's me living in a dream world. That's not possible. The second statement is that all human beings, as human beings, must have access to the truth. This is another important idea from Plato. And these are kind of Plato's kind of statements on language and reality. All human beings, as human beings, must have access to the truth, which means people have to be free to pursue it, but it also means that people have a responsibility to pursue it and not say, oh, that doesn't, I'm not really concerned about that, or I don't think it exists, or I'm not worried about it. No, insofar as you're a human being and you're living with other people, you have a responsibility and an obligation to try to understand how things are, to the extent that it's possible for an individual to do that, and to the extent that maybe their circumstances allow them to do that. The third statement is truth presupposes a relationship and sincere dialogue between human beings. So truth presupposes a relationship and a sincere dialogue between human beings. So in other words, people have to be free to speak what they believe to be true, with the understanding that they could be mistaken and have to be willing to admit that and seek the truth or to acknowledge the truth when it becomes apparent what the truth is. But sometimes that's a hard thing to do. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with, and I think um, uh, is this idea of what a college or a university is for, and what the term academic means, because we get the word academic from Plato's academy. The academos was a grove where Plato met his students. It's a park, and actually you can still go there in Athens, um, and go to the place where Plato taught his students. Okay, and I want to read this because I think this is probably an important thing to remember. So on page 38, and he says that there has to be a place of freedom where people can discuss the highest things with a desire to understand one another, but also a desire to understand how things actually are in the world. Okay. And so on the bottom of page 38, he's going to talk about what it means to be academic. Okay. And what this would mean, what a college or university is for. Academic must mean anti-sophistic. So in other words, the academy cannot be a place where there's sophistry. This implies also opposition to anything that could destroy or distort the nature of the word as communication and its unbiased openness to reality. Okay? In this respect, we are able to pronounce the general principle at the very same time to be very specific. To be academic or anti-sophistic, I'm adding that in, is an opposition is required against every partisan simplification, every ideological agitation, every blind emotionality, against seduction through well-turned yet empty slogans, against autocratic terminology with no room for dialogue, against personal insult as an element of style, all the more despicable the more sophisticated it is, against the language of evasive appeasement and false assurances, which Karl Jaspers considered a form of modern sophistry, and not least against the jargon of the revolution, against categorical conformism and categorical nonconformism. Do we have to go on? Now, I think if you can go back and reflect on that from time to time, you might find it useful. I think this book is very important for our time and for all times. And I think Josef Pieper did us a great service by giving us this work. So anyway, I'm going to wrap it up here. But as always, I'm going to end it with a poem. This is one that I did myself recently. I think last week sometime, there was we had a little summer storm, a little rain that came through, and I kind of like to sit out on my back patio with my dog and just kind of watch the sunset and and stuff. And so it's just a very pretty sort of rainfall. And so the rain, I don't know about you, but sometimes it just kind of meditative. So anyway, And while I was watching it, just had kind of all these kind of thoughts and emotions and things. Um, so anyway, this is called Rain. Rain falling upon the grass makes no sound. The sound of rainfall loses itself in lush greenness. There is the mystery of rain in the cessation of noise, from the sound of raindrops striking rhythm on pavement. Now the rain brightens itself in sunlight and lightning. Now the rain is convex and reflective on the feathers of the dove. Now the rain softens the sky in rivulets of azure streaming between the desiccated clouds. Within this space of yard, the rain achieves a peculiar patois. What is the rain saying? The rain is saying everything. Guys, if you have any questions about the lecture or anything, please let me know. And I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.